Good morning, Chris. Your performance was great. I really enjoyed it, and I think the audiences will get a real treat from it as well. So we'd love for you to share just some of your experiences with the different pieces, a little something about the work itself, and if you worked with the composer, what was that like? And also maybe a little something about the camera, because that was a new angle, literally, that we were able to watch. We don't get to see that, that point of view from the camera. So perhaps we could start some with Dancing Trees by Goulet.
With Goulet, I think he gave me a lot of freedom. He didn't really tell me what to do, what not to do. For me, the real challenge of this piece is really I think it's clarity, because you're going between two different voices. During the recording process, I recorded it in different tempos. The one that we settled on was the one that had the most clarity, really. The real difficulty there for this work, it's really because the harmonics, not every harmonics uses the same bow energy input. So the real difficulty is just making sure that every slur has a shape. So you got like da da dee da dee da dee dee dee, and they all have to fall in a line or a gesture. And then on top of that, you add in one or two accents which are not harmonics. Goulet was very helpful also. Like, he actually made some really minor small changes to the detail. I think it's mainly the slurrings, that the deeming of the slurrings of how he actually did it. His piece is actually nice to listen to at first, but it's actually very difficult to execute. It's one of those very quiet pieces, but then the amount of effort it takes to make something so quiet and pure is a lot, actually.
Simple is never easy. Well, it had the sense of undulating waves, as was talked about in the notes, and to create that, which I thought you did very well. There's a lot of craft behind making that possible. What about the camera? Camera work, what was that experience like for you?
We already had a few pre-decided takes on how we would do the entire project. Of course, there were some preferences for a particular take for certain pieces. So like we applied every possibility on the instrument, and then we see like if this is doable, and then like among all the doables, which one would fit best the piece. For Goulet one, because it is so light and it's so fast, right, that we could only do it here. Because any wobble from the instrument, I don't remember we having a one by the scroll for that piece. For the entire project, I was swapping back between two instruments. I've got an old Italian, and then I've got a 10-year-old Viola by a modern maker. And the varnish, I didn't want to scratch the old Italian. So I think the clamp of the GoPro, it's interesting. It needed the tripod thing, but then I almost had to like cling wrap the scroll, and then you clamp it on the scroll, and then it takes there, and it needs to be tight. I remember with Goulet, I was practicing on an old Italian, because it sounded really nice on the old Italian. And then after that, we wanted to have it on this take, and it had to be done on the new one, because like the new one with the new violas, the varnish don't get scratched out so easily.
A lot of decisions have to be made.
I initially practiced that, and then eventually, like something like a week before, I moved on to the new instrument and just applied everything on the new instrument. Took a while to get used to that.
That's real behind the scenes then. What about Spring Rain?
That one requires a little bit more imagination. What you see on the score is not what you're going to get. So it's one of those kind of music where, as an artist, you have a little bit more liberty. Joseph was very helpful, telling me like what the inspirations were. You got to really find a way to make sure that there is a passage and it sounds clear. I would say it's actually quite a forgiving piece, because it doesn't dictate hard expression. I think what I brought to the table was a little bit more possibilities, things that he probably didn't thought of, because I actually suggested him how there's so many possibilities to actually plug the instrument, to strum it, to flick it, there's so many ways to plug. In one generic term, like just pizzicato, that actually has an entire world of possible
fingertip pluck. Or
what's really interesting is that not everything is employed. Like, people don't really explore. It's always a generic, like, I need you to plug here. But if it's really worth a trip, then I think you should really do as much as you can to discover what the possibilities are for that with just one note. And then for that one, I introduced the flip, like how you would flick a traditional guqin. One of the influence for this piece was this instrument called the guqin, which is an ancient Chinese instrument. Well, it's not ancient. There are people actually doing it. And also, I do know a little bit about this instrument. This instrument actually, you actually learn it in poetry. I think that's what it is. Like that was the olden way where one symbol, it could look like one Chinese character, but that character in itself tells you so many information. Like this is what note, this is how you play it. It's loud, soft.
The techniques have names, like I make it up, but like Dragon's Breath, and you create something from that poetic notion.
And I think I took that element out and brought it into the piece.
What about Pandemic?
I got to work with Jon Lin. She came over and then we played through the piece a few times. I guess she wrote it in a way to make it straightforward. The name in itself also is quite straightforward. Like this is about now, and the music in itself is very upfront. It's a bit intense, but it's not too difficult to understand. She does employ the virtuosic lyrical element of the instrument. It's actually mostly quite lyrical, though I would say her writing is very lyrical. So it's not too out of this world. So it's actually very easy to interpret.
A lot of contrast between the different pieces. I really enjoyed that aspect. They're all very different then.
Pandemic was my first piece that I wanted to take in the recording process. We were meant to start like really early, and I think Pandemic didn't require that much like.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it was definitely the first piece to go. Yeah, I think we recorded it like 3 times, I think.
This concert is so different than a live performance, isn't it? There are just so many other
factors. We used the second take, and it was very clean. CHUA Wei one was the one that after recording, I wanted the speed to go faster. And then after that, I had second thoughts about it in post-production. It didn't have the effect that I wanted. Because you don't know, right? Because without the live element, you don't actually see the way how it's executed. So your imagination is limited to the ears when you're hearing it with the tempo. So when you're hearing it, you're like, oh, I think it could go faster. But then you just came out from the room where you've been playing it faster. So you just wonder whether it would sound more brilliant. So that was the case with Emily Cole. The piece is actually quite challenging there. One of the things I was really pushing for was the extreme dynamic range on top of whatever colors that she wanted. Issue with recording it in a studio is that you can't use acoustical soft. You know what I mean? You can't go so soft that you're almost unhearable, because like everything is heard in a recording studio, right?
Well, the recording engineer becomes, in a way, the film director and has a lot to say about what we're going to hear.
I was really trying very hard to create the extreme softness on top of what Emily wanted in the score. It's just having that extreme highs and extreme lows.
Stunning contrast, and you did that very beautifully, very expressively. Then we get to Lionheart, very virtuosic piece.
I think it was quite nice to have an Emily Cole and a Bertram side to side. I think I recorded them back to back. The temperament is mostly similar. The style is different, but they generally require the same musical temperament.
With huge bursts of energy and explosive.
Yeah. It's a high level kind of functioning where you have to be so aware of what's really happening. Is this what you're happy now? And then on top of that, you've got to make sure that like exactly as you go in time with the recording, you're in control. It's one of those pieces where it's not, if it's not the rhythm, it's the bow, it's this, it's that. Yeah. With Lionheart, it's the never-ending ricochets. Really, you've got to make sure the bow doesn't stop bouncing. But it's actually a very powerful work. I think for me, I didn't think I did a very good job at all. If anything, it was like a touch and go kind of situation in my earlier performance, and it didn't have the conviction that I have in this recording, I would say. But this recording itself, I think I had the time to actually really explore what I wanted to bring out in this piece. Just having the freeness with Bertram and Emily's work really allowed me. I guess I had so much to really how to say it, it didn't feel like everything was uneven. You need to have so much discipline to do like CHUA Wei, Jon Lin and Joseph's piece, and then with Emily and Bertram, they're free, but then they are also technically demanding.
Well, it was actually a beautiful putting together of pieces. Would you consider doing this as a live performance sometime, as a concert for solo viola?
Yeah, I do. I think that one of the biggest difference this project made was really just handling the camera. Working with the GoPro was a main challenge. I think with Emily Cole and Bertram and Joseph also had a little bit of some of these effects that they wanted to capture close up. Jon Lin was more lyrical. I guess you just wanted to film the boam. You know what I mean? The whole kind of
I guess as you're
expression.
playing, you can't think about that too much because you have
Yeah,
music, right? Not to
yeah.
worry about
Uh,
other things.
it's yeah, it's just really yeah, and then I had to get used to the weight of the GoPro on the scroll, and then the GoPro on the head, and then the GoPro on the
A
arm.
new appendage of the body, in a sense.
The recording process was actually quite grueling, I would say. It's just because like the intensity for this piece really it's for all these pieces, they are actually quite difficult.
That's great to hear behind the scenes, Chris, because the performance, the videos are just beautiful and they seem so natural and so effortless. But we know there's a lot of work that goes behind that. So we want to thank you very much for being a part of this. It's really a very special event. Hi, Guwei. Thank you so much for being with us today. Really look forward to talking to you about your piece, Dancing Trees.
The work, Dancing Trees, is hugely inspired by nature. Also has how I think about nature and my personal relationship with nature, especially in Singapore, because like it being like a garden city, right? So we will expect a lot of trees and nature as being part of the city's urban landscape. So I thought that the relationship between like nature, I mean like between the trees and nature and the urban like concrete structures, this kind of contrast, quite an interesting idea for me to explore on. In the piece, I guess the way that I kind of symbolize or like the dichotomy of nature and artificial construct is through the use of natural harmonics on the viola, um, in contrast with like the real notes that the performer plays, and how these two kind of gradually morph from one to the other and kind of flowing in a way that's like undulating waves, right? So I guess that's the gist, like the main idea of the piece. Yeah.
There you are in the United States. And did you compose this piece in the US?
Yes.
Were you reflecting upon your memories of nature in Singapore, which is very tropical, and you're in northeastern United States where it's not tropical?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
where were you placing yourself in terms of finding the inspiration from nature?
Well, I guess like when I'm not physically in Singapore, but I have to write a piece about Singapore, I mean, the only thing that I can rely on is my memories, right, of home and how, yeah, so basically just memories. So I was using more of that as my main like, drive, like the main kind of visual motivation when I wrote the piece. Not so much of like the nature here, because it's, yeah, to say it's really different.
Does other work of yours also refer to nature, draw from nature in some way?
I would say some, increasingly so in recent years, I'm more attracted to natural themes and just ideas.
It had a very beautiful flow to it, the work. And there was a mention of undulating waves and this sense of
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
flowingness. I really enjoyed that a great deal.
Thank
Um,
you. Yeah.
yeah, I thought it had a very beautiful flow. I was speaking to Chris about that, and he mentioned finding the right tempo. So that's always a tricky thing, isn't it? And to find exactly the right tempo on that. Could you talk a little bit about tempo?
We actually worked a bit together to come up with an agreement or like a tempo that we both felt comfortable. I guess one feature about this piece that is not too conventional is that there are no bar lines, there are no bars, and so I was kind of thinking like not in terms of pulse, but more of like individual notes, and because even because each wave can have different lengths and different magnitude. So yeah, so because of that, there's a lot of freedom in the tempo and also in terms of how much rubato to use. Because the piece is marked with moto rubato from the start. Personally, I'm actually not too I mean, I want some degree of freedom from the performer as well. So I wouldn't dictate how exactly each part should be slower or faster. So I kind of let Chris decide that for his own when he played the piece, and when we did our rehearsal, he kind of just played it back to me, and I was like, okay, I like this part, and maybe this part you can go more rubato and etc. So yeah, so that's how we worked it out, and I think it turned out to. I mean, the end result turned out to be great. Yeah.
It reminds me of something Beethoven would talk about, how he would go into the woods, the Viennese woods, and in his walks he would feel the stirringness of nature, and he would feel that within himself. And it's not that he was actually trying to literally depict nature, but it was more of a feeling and something that he made him feel connected to nature. It feels that that's very similar in your work.
Yeah, I can say so too. It's well, although I can't really go into the woods like the Singapore woods to feel that, but I'm kind of going to my mind, yeah.
But it also is a reminder of how important memory is, and how memory, actually what is memory? Because when we think of it, it's also in the present. So it becomes a kind of present and not past. When you're thinking of it, it's not past. So when you think of your time in Singapore, maybe Pulau Ubin or at the Botanic Gardens, it becomes something that is in your moment now. So in fact, it's present.
Absolutely.
Kind of a play with time.
Yeah. And it's also very different, especially when you really miss a place, I think that kind of gives it a special emotional side as well.
Right. There is an expression, absence makes the heart grow fonder. So maybe, maybe there's some element of that. And I just spoke with Emily, who also lives in the United States and currently. There is this sense of reconnecting through technology. This collaborative work for you, in a sense, brought you back to Singapore, virtually back. What was that like for you?
That's pretty much what most musicians are doing during this pandemic time. So I mean, for me, I really enjoyed the the whole process of connecting with people, even though we're not physically together, but being able to just connect with people at home or even elsewhere, just amazing. Like for example, I've been teaching my parents piano recently through online, and because before the pandemic happened, we never thought that this was possible, and we were like, oh, well, you can do that, and then we just started a few months ago, and now they're doing really well.
I think in spite of the negative impact, and there's certainly that, we cannot deny that, but there's also a very positive impact, and a new paradigm seems to be emerging in which ironically, we're getting closer through our technology, connecting in new ways.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for the interview. We have really enjoyed hearing you talk about your piece. It's really flowing and lovely. I think people will enjoy listening to it and will feel the calmness of that, and maybe it would inspire them to go take a walk in the forest. Hi, Joseph. Really enjoyed your work, Spring Rain, very beautifully played by Chris on the viola. It's always fascinating when there's a poem and that poem inspires the music, but the music is not setting the poem. So you're not using words. So you're not actually using the words of the poem. Can you talk a little bit about that, and also why this particular poem, why this choice?
So when I graduated from university, actually, some of my close friends actually bought me this book, if I could just show it to you here. It's called How to Read a Chinese Poem, a Bilingual Anthology of Tang poetry. And they actually said that they wanted me to use this book to inspire my future works. So that is, in a sense, why I composed this, actually.
And it did.
And it did, yes. If I just go to one of the poems that I used, which is Spring Rain on CHUA Jon, I think what you say was very interesting, right? That I'm not setting this poem, right? It's inspiring an instrumental work. I'll probably say that the words are still important, even though I'm not, no one is going to sing it. Because, I mean, Spring Rain, when I look at this poem, I think two things caught my eye. Is that firstly, I guess the external atmosphere of rain, right? Dejectedly, I lie down in casual clothes on this new spring day, and the raindrops fell on the wavering lamb, you know? So there are two things that's happening, right? There is an internal dimension of this poet's dejectedness and unfulfilled longing, and it's stated quite clearly here, actually. My wishes are unfulfilled. And there's also the external, the atmospheric, which is the rain. So that's something that's a bit like call it a pathetic fallacy, right? Where your external mood and external environment actually reflects the internal emotional state. And I think that actually the words are important as well, because let me go back to that statement, my wishes are unfulfilled. In my score, my tempo marking was with unfulfilled longing. So in a sense, it's there as well, right? But also that, so the two things are talking about external and internal. So in the external, right, the sound of rain, I think is quite clear in the composition, right? The colonial batutu having this sound, right? So that's the external. But I guess there's a more melancholic side as well, you know, the use of the harmonics and the use of the sliding tones, but it's more melancholic. And we have this internal, how to say, dimension as well. You hear the rain, but you also hear this internal dejectedness or unfulfilled longing as well. Something that I sort of trying to look at. So in a sense, the words are still important, I guess. But then I just, in a sense, focus not just on the words, but the emotions that I want to convey through the composition.
You know, that reminds me of Jean-Paul Sartre. And there's a poem that exactly says that. It's il pleut dans mon cœur, which is it rains in my heart. So it is exactly that inside-outside that you're talking about. It's perhaps a human condition, isn't it? The unrequited longing. That's human condition there.
That's very true. Yeah.
So you have both the Chinese text and an English translation. So are you triangulating from them, or are you, how is your relationship? Because I think that the feeling from the Chinese would be quite different than the feeling from the English.
To be honest, I didn't really triangulate, but it's more just trying to sort of pick up, I guess, key ideas from the text. And what really struck me was this inside and outside thing as well.
Okay.
But I guess talking about the Chinese part, I guess, I mean, there is a Chinese influence sort of as well. I think it's quite a subtle, not too overt Chinese flavoring as well. Actually, this piece of music was, if I just talk about more of its history, it was actually composed, in a sense, in response to a research that I did. So when I was studying for my composition degree in RAM, or the Royal Academy of Music, I was actually looking at the music of Kam Ki-yong, actually, Singapore composer Kam Ki-yong.
Yeah.
He was actually from RAM as well, so there was something, that's the reason why I sort of took that research. And what's interesting about the music of Kam Ki-yong is that, you know, the culture plays a very big role in his music. Extremely big role. I mean, it's not just in his works, but even his interviews that he gave to newspapers, and even interview that I actually did with him as well. The use of Chinese culture to him was important. He said that China, not just about, to him being Singaporean was to be Chinese, you know. So I was quite interested in this dimension, and I was very inspired by his piece that I analyzed in my work, which was Huaigu for solo violin. So in a sense, this piece for solo viola, or originally solo violin, is like a dialogue with Huaigu actually. Looking at this poem and looking at the process, talking about what does it mean to use Chinese culture in music? What does it actually mean? There's one way to do it, to just use the pentatonic scale, right? But that's a bit too, too overt, So I was also, through my research, being in dialogue with an older Singaporean composer. And for my work, I mean, what's interesting is that I was trying to be as subtle as possible with these Chinese influences, and maybe I can go into that more strongly with my collaboration actually with Chris. While I was working with Chris, what was very interesting was I actually shared with him this story, and after he heard my story, he actually started to play it, and at one point in time, he started to flip the strings, and that was not in my original score. My original score only had, I think, Kolengo Batutu, Ako, and Pizzicato. But what he did was to sort of flick the string, because he said that is more, in a sense, more like a sanxian or a guqing, kind of drier percussive sound. And that was, by the way, not in my score at all, actually. I didn't even know that such things could be done on the instrument. So that was quite interesting, where I guess with this collaboration with the performer actually gives an added dimension. He knows my music more than me, correct? I can give him the idea, but then he flies with it, I guess. I mean, so that was quite an interesting chance, I guess, to work with him.
That's the beauty in collaboration, because you bring all you are, and the performer brings all they are. And when we meet, if it's a genuine meeting, an authentic meeting, then these are the things that happen, which is wonderful. And somehow we are the better for that.
Yes.
I enjoyed his performance. I felt the feeling was quite pensive then, and the sense of space was wonderful.
Thank you.
Is that something that are you conscious? Is it an unconscious thing, the sense of space?
I mean, sense of space where I guess I was trying to do as much as possible with as limited music material as possible. I guess that was quite a conscious act as well. I guess at a point in time, I was also developing in my own compositional language, where I guess I was at one point doing too many things. I guess I had too many ideas. I was not being focused, and I guess through the years and through this conversation, I was trying to sort of really narrow down my language to be as succinct as possible, I think. Yes.
Well, it really seemed to exemplify that expression that less is more. And I felt that very much in hearing it, that less is more. In fact, in those wonderful spaces and silences, I felt a richness, a hugeness. So that lent a lot to it. And, going back to the poetry, it's Tang Dynasty poetry. That's not even contemporary China or China in recent history. This is China of some time ago. And so do you feel that by diving into that poem, you take a time travel? You are uniting with something that is centuries and centuries and centuries ago. But at that point that you connect with the poem, it's now.
Yes. I mean, that's really true. I think, well, it's from the past. This poetry is for the past. But I guess it's something that's quite universal as well. I mean, there are things that don't change, I guess. Human emotions, they don't really change too much. I mean, technology do change, the way we express things change, but I guess there's some emotions that don't change, the idea of unfulfilled longing, which is not just a Chinese thing, right? It's quite typical, I guess, even in the West as well, in Western music as well. Unfulfilled longing. Condition, or as I said at the start of the interview, this human condition that's not just about, I guess, being united with something from the past, but something really human, I guess.
How it cuts across barriers, if we want to call them that. There is absolute beauty in culture and indigenousness. However, underneath all of that are perhaps very strong shared experiences. Because you have the Tang Dynasty poem, you have yourself, composer, you have Chris, the violist, and then you have us, the listener fan.
Really
thank you so much. It's been
thank you so much.
Getting your insight on Spring Rain. Hi, Jon Lin. Thank you so much for being a part of this. Really enjoyed your piece, Pandemic.
It's pretty obvious when this was composed, given the title. I started thinking about this piece more as an expression, right, of the times and of my mental state at that time, probably, during the circuit breaker or lockdown. It was really a reflection of my own mental state of not knowing what was going to come next and how everything would pan out, right? I think there was a question that was big on everyone's minds.
You mentioned, mentioned how everything will pan out, and you spell the word in pandemic, and you put the parentheses around. Can you talk about that? How did that come about?
Oh, I just thought it was interesting that pandemic, and it's actually like panic. You think about like it's a state of panic, and I think that pretty much reflected what a lot of people were feeling at the time. As for us as artists, it was like the future of live concert music was like, oh no, what's going to happen now? And of course, as composers, we are part of this whole ecosystem. It was a real anxiety, I would say. So it was totally just a product of the times.
Jon Lin, it's truly contemporary music, isn't it? If contemporary means, as you said, of the times, this is about as contemporary as we could be.
And the formats of the presentation as well. And the fact that we're having a Zoom interview, I mean, that's completely contemporary.
Well, isn't that right? We live in the same city, right?
Yeah, and during the Zoom being a format that was popularized during because of the pandemic, really.
It's probably brought society into a new paradigm, and it has triggered a general acceptance of this technology. I was using Skype since I think about 2003 or 4, and it was actually quite primitive then, and few people were even using it at that point. And so this is about 16, 17 years later. I think we're embracing that in a very new and open kind of way. Back to the piece. Can you tell us then a little bit, what I'm always interested to is this translation of feeling, emotion, experience into the music. And there's a mention, a reference somehow to Beethoven's, is it Muss es sein?
Yes, I think removing it from its original context, in the original Beethoven's, it's very, dramatic, it's very expressive. And of course, there are dramatic moments in this piece as well, but in a very different way. But I mean, I could talk about the general musical language of this piece first. I think in this piece and many of my pieces, there's a lot of emphasis on contrast, from fragmentary gestures to very long lines, which is, and the longer lines, of course, is characteristic of traditional, strings repertoire, right? Stuff that we are actually familiar with already. But we have other things that is a lot of little fragmentary gestures in here, short phrases, things like that. And the other kind of contrast was a timbral contrast between insubstantial sort of sounds versus more substantial, lush string sounds. But at the same time, you have the opposite of the spectrum, which are all the harmonics, all the sul ponticello type of sounds, the pizzicati. That pacing reflects a sort of emotional state, where you sort of oscillate between being very agitated and worried, and in the next moment just like blanking out, really, pretty much. I mean, there were times during the circuit breaker where I was just immerse myself in work and in reading novels, like totally just try to sort of escape from reality, because of just to escape from thinking about, oh my God, what's going to come next and what's going to happen. And then the next moment thinking, oh man, I have all these things that were postponed, and what's going to happen to all the premieres, and are they ever going to happen? There are all these contrasts that I think really do tie in with my own state of mind at that time.
I think it's extraordinary, especially as an artist, as a composer, you have the means or the format to express that and to articulate that into something, into music. So would you say then that had it not been for the COVID-19 and the pandemic, that you wouldn't have written this piece?
I mean,
how different how does it depart from anything in your language, or were there new new streams of consciousness coming into this?
Well, I mean, apart from the subject matter, I don't really think so, except that this piece does differ a little from my recent output, the rest of my recent output, in that I engage a little bit more with sort of traditional styles of writing, simply because it was for a string instrument, which, I mean, when you write for instruments like, a strings instrument or piano, it's very hard to sort of turn your back on traditional repertoire, this whole mountain that lies behind these instruments, as opposed to writing for, say, saxophone or percussion. It just comes from a different place, right? You don't have that whole heavy weight of tradition upon you, right? So in this piece, I was a little bit more conscious of that sort of that where these instrumental practices were coming from. Towards the middle of the piece, right, where you actually have even though the musical language is still atonal and all that, but and you have just traditional sort of bowing, long bowings, double stops, everything that's phrasings, musical phrasings that are still traditional lush strings type of timbres.
And I find that very fascinating too, because given the circumstances of the pandemic, which are quarantine limitations, no go, no fly, stay at home, where life becomes much more isolated. And yet you're talking about expanding horizons and more possibilities and opening up. I think that's just a beautiful duality of that. And when given restrictions, actually, ironically, we can find more possibilities through the restrictions.
That actually reminds me of what Haydn said. Yeah, Haydn had this quote that he was forced to be original when he was staying with the Esterházys, right? Yeah, right. He did have such a quote that being isolated from the world, I was forced to be original. But of course, it's a very different sort of context that we are living in, because our isolation, despite it being physical and geographical, we are not really living in that world of isolation in thought or culture, because we have ready access to the internet and social media and all that. So it's still possible to keep abreast with the times and the trends, And I think even for the so-called contemporary techniques that I use in the piece, these aren't cutting edge contemporary techniques. I mean, these have been used on many other pieces before mine. So yes, it's still quite a traditional piece, I would say.
If only Haydn had internet. Then.
Yeah. He would have many other means of reaching out to the European audience of the time, right? Social media and everything. Yeah.
What struck me too about your piece was how it seemed to orchestrate the instrument. The viola was orchestrated.
Thank you.
And I really enjoyed that, all those possibilities, and it allows us to see how a singular instrument need not be a singular sound or a singular perspective, that it has multiple possibilities.
Let's put it this way. I mean, traditionally we think of timbre as clothing for pitchers, right? in that way, but for me it's really pretty much one of the main building blocks of the music itself. Yeah, in which so it's not just about like motivic sort of unity or anything like that, but also the structure is in some sense demarcated by all these timbral gestures.
Any word about working with Chris?
He's very experienced in doing new music and new pieces and contemporary pieces. So with certain other performers that are not so used to doing new works, sometimes they ask you a lot of questions. So, how do I do this? And with him, of course, it was okay. You look at it, so sul ponticello, sure. I mean, it's all very, very normal in his vocabulary, right? It was possible to have a two-way input instead of just like the composer's input and the performer just doing what the composer wants. This is more of a collaborative kind of project where it wasn't just me having my work played by the performer and the performer being just a tool to realize that performance, but rather I actually got quite some input from him too. on certain bits, and we discuss how would you like to play this and so on and so forth. What are the things that were awkward strings wise, and for instance, I had a figure where I had the harmonic, a natural harmonic, being played with the same finger. And of course, strings players are very used to sort of shifting without trace. I mean, that's what a professional player should be doing. Yeah, that became strange because the reason for sort of writing it with different fingers was to have a little sort of timbral wave in there, as it were. So it's not just like one long harmonic sound. Ironically, of course, that effect did not come out as well as intended because of how well trained the players are. I mean, this and again, I think of the other anecdote of this other example of the bassoon solo in The Rite of Spring. Yeah. Right. In Stravinsky's time, he had intended for it to sound strained and
almost impossible to play.
Yes, but the irony is that with the passing of time, today it's such a standard. It's part of standard rep for bassoonists. That that strain quality no longer comes out because it's just we can play it. but then that quality of sort of having the performer struggle a little bit and trying it gets lost. So that was something that I found out through such a collaboration. Conceptually I was thinking, it would be a good idea to have that shift, but then in practice they were so well trained that it virtually makes no difference from just playing on one finger, right?
Thank you for sharing that, because our viewers get a real insight to that dynamic relationship, that symbiotic relationship, right, between all collaborators. Well, it's been really, it's really great talking to you and hearing about your piece. It's lovely. And if the viewers haven't listened yet, then they should go right to it and have a listen. Hi, Emily. Thank you so much for joining us on this. And I'm so excited to talk to you about your piece, Megabyte.
So Megabyte was the first piece I composed after the pandemic hit in March the 10th or something. When I first got back from New York to Atlanta, that was the day that everything shut down. Broadway shut down, Carnegie Hall shut down. Everything was just, okay, we're now in a pandemic. And that was crazy because the day before coming back, I was playing in Carnegie Hall. And the next day it just shut. So that was a big contrast. And for about 3 or 4 weeks, I couldn't really do anything. I didn't compose for about 3 weeks, which was a little bit crazy. But I think that was just my way of figuring out what happens next, because when you have something like 20 performances just canceled, hits really, really hard. So this piece was the first piece I composed after all of that happened. It was, I guess, a reflection of my time in the pandemic. So I was very lucky that I was home, because it was the 2 weeks between New York and going back to New York for a different performance that I had at home. So, when everything shut down, it was rather convenient that I was already home. Basically could only stay home. So every day it was the same 4 walls, the same, scenery. I walked out on the back porch and looked at the same trees. And so everything was rather repetitive. And I think that repetition was showcased in this piece. But every single repetition is just slightly different, but you don't really hear the differences unless you really dig into it. And that was kind of the musical germ for this piece, Megabyte.
So that very pulsed opening that you had, you feel that might have some kind of subconscious underpinning from the sameness of what your everyday reality was at the time.
Most of my day I spend in front of a computer, and still within the same 4 walls. So, that repetition is still rather similar now. There's maybe a little bit more that you can do, like going to get groceries instead of getting groceries delivered and stuff like that, like day-to-day things. But, yes, that repetition, that rather intense in-your-face repetition was definitely how I felt back then.
I was so struck at how dramatic the piece was, and in fact, it felt a lot like a soliloquy then, and it had such sharp contrast in it. I really felt that was so powerful. can you talk a little bit, a bit more about the unfolding of the piece?
Yeah, so I think the piece actually, on the surface is very fast and active, but the unfolding of the piece itself is rather slow. Like the large picture changes are rather slow. And I think it's because when you're in this day-to-day, cycle, you don't feel the small changes. But when you realize what has changed over time, there's a click moment that you realize, oh, actually, in May, this is what's different from what happened in March, and that realization is rather sudden, even if the smaller repetitions and cycles don't really feel that different. So I think in that piece you can hear larger shifts in musical elements. For example, when we get to the D harmonics in the middle, slightly middle section, things start moving faster until we get to the really active part with all the changing lights. Feels as if we're actually going somewhere, but we have been moving and going somewhere since prior to that. It's just at that moment when you suddenly hear a shift that you realize that actually there's been so much happening, and that happeningness continues building up toward the large, fast, loud section where all the colors start changing with hard, shots, hard changes rather than fade in and fade out. It's like sudden, very clear changes in color.
You know how we think of music as the art of time. And so and time is an illusion itself. And so we work with how time is perceived. So this piece does seem to compress and stretch and manipulate time then. It must have felt extraordinary whilst you were composing it, your own sense of time. Because as you were saying, it's reflective of what you were experiencing externally as well as internally.
Yeah, absolutely. And the funny thing is this piece was composed in a rather short amount of time. I think I composed it within a week and a half or 2 weeks, because I wasn't composing for a long time before that, which, for me is very unusual. So I think 3 weeks or 4 weeks of just thinking and solidifying ideas made it easy to just write really, really quickly, which doesn't happen for me at all.
From abstinence came the sudden burst of, whoa, here it is. Well, it feels like that because it's such a burst of energy. The ending is quite interesting too. It felt that something was acquiescing or something was emptying into yet another world. I enjoyed I think the form of it was very strong, very powerful. And that largely comes from the dualities that you were just describing.
So Chris and I worked a lot. We had 2 or 3 rehearsals with the music so that we could just hear each other, talk about the piece and hear how Chris was interpreting it. So that was really helpful to just work over Zoom and hear some music being performed for the first time in what seems like a long time. So that was really rewarding. And also Chris had a lot of say when we were editing the videos and talking about shots and scenes and colors and transitions, all the art direction. Chris was also really, really involved in that. And I was really thankful for that because as a musician, I was not, I'm not a professional artist or a videographer or anything like that, but I had some idea of what I wanted it to look like because I have a certain interest in just the visual arts. For example, those paintings there, those are my paintings.
Really? Oh.
Yeah, so I have a certain interest in the visual arts, even though it's an amateur interest. But since it's a project that we're gonna make online and be available to everyone, I really wanted to, try something different with the video art form. And so, having someone to bounce ideas off and also just, someone to keep me on track and, in the right state of mind was actually really, really helpful. So it was really wonderful working with Christoven on all aspects of this project, visual and musical as well. So
it was really collaborative, wasn't it?
It was. And I think that's what I like That's the style of composing that I enjoy, because I do know that as a composer, I have my own points of view, but those points of view may not always be the most effective or portrays the performer that I'm working with the best. And so I think it's really important, at least for my creative process, to bring others into the conversation, because it really helps me learn and it helps me produce a better work.
Exactly. Well, also, as a Singaporean, this brought you, in a sense, back home. Did you have that sense of connecting to Singapore, though there you are in the United States during this whole process and this whole collaborative effort?
Absolutely. I mean, Chris and I have worked on other things in the past. He's played several of my works for viola and toy piano, or some violin pieces that I transcribed for viola for him. So this was not the first time we're working, and with every project, it feels like we just know each other a little bit more and feel more comfortable being critical about each other, which I think as an artist and as a composer is a really, really meaningful and important step to take when you're doing collaborative projects like this.
It's great to hear you say that, because the social fabric of interaction and collaboration with other humans is so critical. And the technology should not be a boundary to that. In fact, we have in this example how the technology has only enhanced it and allowed it to be even more proliferated, which is great.
Yeah, it's really wonderful, because in the time we are in quarantine, or I guess supposed to be, separated from other humans, Zoom coming in made it feel as if international collaborations like this is even more possible. So I've been, working with people from all over the US and Europe and Singapore while all this is happening, and it feels so natural now. Like it almost feels like the world is smaller, because Zoom is available for everyone, and it's normal to be a little square on the computer screen. So that's actually a really, really wonderful feeling. So yeah, I'm very thankful for that, even though I know the pandemic has been hard.
But one great paradox is that the quarantine has also brought people closer together in some ways.
Yeah, I definitely feel that way for a lot of the musical collaborations I'm working on. So while there were projects that got canceled or postponed, there were many more that came in to take its place. And since I am moving toward more of a collaborative, style of creation with specific people, I feel that the Zoom technology actually does bring us closer and opens up more possibilities for performances and digital presentations that we might not have thought about before the pandemic.
And conversations like this.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. It's really lovely to talk to you. Thank you so much, Ben.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah. Hi, Bertram. We're talking about your virtuosic piece, Lionheart. And it's just such a massive experience of this full-on energy then. And this was written for a violist. Can you talk a little bit about the origins of the piece?
Actually, funnily enough, the piece was actually written for a violinist who asked me to write back when I was in college. She needed a piece for a performance of some sort, and I wanted to write something reasonably virtuoso. As you've mentioned, it's being performed on the viola because the piece is written in tablature. So the piece can be performed on any one of the standard classical string instruments with 4 strings. Yeah.
What about the title itself, Lionheart? I mean, that kind of gives itself away, but did the title come afterwards?
It's nothing to do with like British history or anything of the sort, actually, or any of the common notions associated with the word Lionheart. When I was writing the piece, I was contemplating this idea of identity in music and how performers project this through a piece. At the time, I had these thoughts about my identity as a Singaporean musician and how I express that through music. And at some point in the conception of the piece that slowly left, but the title stayed. The goal of the work was really to write something where the performer could project their own identity onto my score, which is something that I try to do in composing in general. My piece becomes a medium by which the performer is able to express themselves.
Identity is quite a big concept and can be quite a swinging door. And it's interesting that you talk about that in writing this piece when you were at the time a student in London and perhaps contemplating on yourself. And that experience of living abroad really does, it affords many questions to come up.
It opens up a space where I really start to look back at my roots, for lack of a better term. Yeah, now that I'm back, I can really see that when I went there to study, I left a lot behind, and there's a lot that I can explore. Yeah, there's a big part of who I am as a composer that is left here.
You wrote this piece as a student in London some years back, and so now you are here in Singapore, listening to the piece now, experiencing the piece, working with Chris, who performed it, I think, really quite exquisitely. But what is your feeling about it now? Do you have a different take? Has the identity shifted?
No, I think the piece does what it wants to do in a way. It's one of the pieces of mine that works out of the box, I think, in the sense that it really provides a space in which the performer has the flexibility to interpret, to engage with a score in a very physical, spontaneous manner.
It has that kind of escape velocity where it can leave Earth's orbit and move on into the galaxy. What was working with Chris like?
I've worked with Chris for the last 2 years, 2 or 3 years on various other projects. He's great to work with. He's open to suggestions and very creative when executing the score. He really makes it his own, which again achieves my goal with the work. Yeah, he spent a lot of time with it. We met up a few times to go through the music, and every time it just gets more and more individual, more spontaneous, and more powerful in that way. Yeah.
You've seen some of the images coming out at this stage. What is your reflection on adding this filmic element? So it's not an archival concert that's simply being videoed and put up on YouTube, which perhaps pre-COVID was the norm. And now we do think differently, perhaps, about what is possible and using the medium for what it can do, meaning more filmic. So what are your thoughts on what you've seen so far?
I quite enjoyed what was done with the visuals. I made it a point to Timothy that I did not want to be involved at all with what he did. Yeah, I wanted him to have free rein to do whatever he wanted with the visuals, because that's what the piece is about. It's about allowing the space for the projecting of your own identity. What I saw in the end highlights the dramatic elements, highlights the dynamism of the work, really brings to the fore the physicality of execution and the virtuosity. Yeah, it's quite dizzying actually, what he did with. Yeah, that makes it very fun to watch. Yeah. It definitely adds a different dimension to the whole thing.
And moving away from the archival template of a music performance, we have a more filmic kind of modality going into place, which then puts the director, filmmaker, camera director more into the driver's seat. They are actually in control of the gestalt or the totality of it.
Yeah, it has the effect of giving him the opportunity to basically mold the experience of the work into some form of different form or shape. Yeah, which is fun. It all fits nicely into what the work is about.
And the risks grow exponentially as well. But
I'm really fine with risk. I think that's the fun of music.
It's a very exciting piece to end with. It has so much drama, and it feels really like a burst of energy. And that's a great way to sort of end that concert. And for our viewers who haven't seen the concert yet, please go watch it, because it is a very exciting concert where Christoven TAN is really exploring some extremely different repertoire. Each one is very different.